I suppose. Okay, cool. Hello, thank you everybody for having me. Yeah, as Andy said, I'm from Loveland, Colorado, originally from the Midwest, and I'm a ceramic artist, and I consider myself a wild clay researcher. I went to school for ceramics and got my BFA at the University of Minnesota in 2010. And then shortly after that, I actually discovered wild clay at a friend's property in the UP of Michigan, and have been really down that road of wild clay ever since, and kind of teaching myself and taking workshops and finding Andy on YouTube and all that kind of self-taught from others. But so, yeah, I've been playing with specular hematite, so I'll let you guys know what I've been learning. And you can find me online at Stinky Cheese Ceramics. That's my kind of ceramics name. So if you want to see more about me later, you can check that out. So as I said, I'm from the Midwest, and so I'm really connected to the UP of Michigan, where I found that wild clay that I've been working with for probably about 15 years. And I really like to dig in and research my materials, and usually that starts with a material that's important to me in some way. And so this clay was this first wild clay that I found, and I've built a program around it where artists can come up to the UP of Michigan and camp for 2 weeks, and we dig the clay out of the ground and we do everything on site and fire on site. We've got some propane gas kilns, and we also do some surface firings, and electric firings. And so that place has a really personal connection and meaning for me. And so a lot of my material research has kind of come out of that place. And the UP is also very well known for rock hounding, has a lot of cool minerals around, and it was a really big area for mining in the industrial age. So there are a lot of mines around there. The bottom left picture there at the Historical Museum, I'm researching actually a wild glaze material that is found up there on the riverbank that someone gave me a bucket of. And so now I've been following down the rabbit hole of that history, and it was used to glaze sewer pipes in the 1800s. And so a lot of times my research will have this connection to the place, and then it dives into the history of that material in that place. And then others who have used that material and that cultural connection is really interesting to me. And there's just some examples of some different wild clays that I've been collecting there in our clay pit at the artist camp. And there's our studio barn on the left up top, and little A-frame was our first structure that we built on this property up in the UP. It was a reclaimed Forest Service cabin. But so then, the specular hematite that I've been using is from the UP of Michigan. So what is specular hematite? It is a variety of iron oxide. So it is an iron oxide, but it's the crystalline structure of it is kind of, they call it micaceous type. It's sort of like flecks of hematite. And so it's really shiny, like mica would be, and silvery to black in color, rather than the red or yellow hematite that you might find. But if you draw with it, it does make a red streak. So that tells you that it is hematite, and it's not something else that could also be kind of sparkly like that. So here's the MinDat mine database website showing the mine where I've collected this. And how I found out about it was actually a friend of mine, Gabby, who now works with me up at the artist camp, told us about this site. She's a rock hound in Michigan and goes up to the UP to collect rocks and minerals all the time. This is the kind of place where you draw a paper map to tell someone how to get places around the UP, which is really exciting, especially if you get one of the cool local old timers to tell you about something. If they draw you a map, you hold on to that map. So we got my paper plate map, and we found this old iron mine dump. So this is in the town of Champion, and it used to be an iron mine, and now it's just an abandoned mine dump. So it's just like the tailings, and just like big piles of rocks in the woods. And so yeah, specular hematite, while I was doing research for this presentation, I realized it's also just called specularite. So I use it sort of interchangeably in the slides here. But you can find this specularite in rocks of all sizes here in the mine dump. And then the granules, which is what I'm most interested in, because I don't want to have to grind it down myself, can just be found, this is just on the ground of the gravel road as you approach the tailing piles. And it's just been washed down from all the tailings onto the gravel road. Here, I was here on a wet day, so I had to kind of just scrape it up with a shovel. But if you're there on a dry day, you can just kind of sweep it up with a little broom and sift it right there if you want. And Gabby often does that and comes to camp with awesome glittery speckles for us. So the first thing I was doing with it is what Gabby was doing with it, was adding it to my clay as a temper, as like a decorative temper. So we'd screen it to get the bigger pieces out and other rocks out. This is just it's just a mesh paint filter bag and an embroidery hoop, and just sift that, and then you get a pretty fine version of the granules there. And then I was just mixing that into my clay mixture as a part of the temper. When we do 20 or 25% temper for pit firing, the most we've done is 5% of that we did specular hematite this last summer to make things pretty glittery. But really you can just add like a little bit, maybe, I don't know, percent or something, and it'd be pretty sparkly. And so I was doing that with pieces, and it's really hard to photograph the sparkles, but this little bucket shape, it's just sparkles in the clay. And this is a high fire porcelain with a bunch of it put in. Some of it looks just kind of like little black specks, but it is very, very sparkly in the sun and if you're moving it around. And then my longest student, my husband, is always doing extra weird experiments in the studio, whatever I'll let him do. So he's been marbling in large amounts of specular hematite into porcelain, marbling it into the clay body, and then firing it without any glaze. And that is still quite shiny as well, but it has started to like melt together and be kind of like, some of it's a little bit brown looking like you would expect iron to be, but it's still quite shiny. And so these were quite high temperatures. I'm sorry, I'm going by Fahrenheit, so you guys might have to do the conversions for the archaeologists. At like 22 or 2300, it's still sparkly, which is, I was sort of surprised that at cone 9 with this porcelain that it was still specular or sparkly, which is just very fun. So I was doing this, and then I learned that there's the Trincheras pottery that used specular hematite as a pigment. And I didn't know anything about them until Andy let me know after I had been bringing specular hematite around that it could be used as a pigment and that this pottery existed. And so I've been doing what research I can. Most of my information has come from Hunter Clay Patch's 2022 dissertation paper. And there's not a lot of other resources online. The Arizona State Museum has a little bit about it on their website. But so just a couple slides about the Trincheras pottery from what I've learned, and forgive me if anything is inaccurate. So I've tried to do as many credits as I can, references, but so the Trincheras pottery the heartland was in Sonora, Mexico, but it does spill over up into Arizona a little bit. And so it hasn't been studied very intensely because it's hard to do that study across international borders. So there've been studies, kind of on both sides, and I think they're still coming around to everybody working together and doing more research. But so the heartland really was the Altar and Magdalena valleys, like right in here of northern Sonora. And when it was first discovered, it was thought to be just a really temporally late derivative of Hohokam pottery. So people thought it was, more like 700, 800, I think, and onward maybe. And they thought it was actually a less skilled or more crude version of Hohokam. But there are definitely many differences. One of the main differences being that Trincheras is produced by coil and scrape method, and Hohokam is paddle and anvil. And then the design elements for Trincheras often include gridded squares, sawtooth pendant rim decorations, and large open line work. And they actually had really finer line designs earlier on, and then later on they had the broad line designs. So I think that's what maybe people were identifying as kind of a crude hohokam, was those broadline designs. That's my guess. But then, and so it was as early as like 300 CE that they've identified decorated purple specular hematite paint on red slipped pottery. So they call it purple. It's got a little bit of a purplish sheen or kind of a blue cast at specular hematite paint. But it's not, it's not super purple, but that's what they're calling it. So as early as 300, but then it really expands in around 800 CE to 1100. This is when they see a lot of cultural mixing across the international border and trading with the hohokam. And definitely there was, there were ideas being exchanged and influences being exchanged. And this is when they expanded into polychromes. So if you've heard of Nogales polychrome or altered polychromes, from what I understand, the Nogales polychrome or those two are some of the oldest polychromes in the Southwest, and so they probably had a lot of influence on other polychromes after that. Claypatch also noticed that there was the most specularity in the pigment at this time. As I'll talk about, I think, in the next slide, some pots they consider just non-specular. It's just not really a sparkly version of the pigment, and some specular. And then later research has shown that it's kind of a continuum and so they'll categorize it as low, medium, or highly specular. But so this went on for about until the 1300 CE or so, when decorated pottery stopped being produced locally here, and they started importing Casas Grandes pottery for decorated wares. And so there's a few main types of the trincheras pottery using the specular hematite as a pigment. So just real briefly, I'll go through those. So purple on red is the specular hematite pigment on a red slipped pot. Purple on brown is that specular hematite pigment on a non-slipped pot. You can see some of the cool gridded squares here and like that broad line work that's classic of the trincheras. And then purple on tan, just there's like a tan brown slip sometimes rather than a red slip. And then purple rimmed utility I thought was interesting. This is something that Hunter Claypatch, I believe, has identified himself in his work. And it's plainware mostly, except for that the rim on the inside and out would be decorated with the specular hematite pigment. I just thought that was interesting. We have a little bit of decoration on what do seem to be more utilitarian wares rather than just decorative pots. And then the polychromes, the stars of the show. So the Nogales polychrome is a red hematite pigment with the specular hematite purple pigment on a white or cream slip. And then altar polychrome is the same, just without the slip. So that Nogales polychrome really stands out with that white slip. And these were about 750 to 1100 AD, it says on this, from the Arizona State Museum, photos of those pieces. And so a little bit about the specular hematite pieces by region. This is also from Hunter Claypatch's dissertation paper. And as I said, yes, so US archaeologists are mostly have identified specular versus non-specular varieties of the pigment, but now it seems like there's kind of space in between that too. So it's a continuum in between, but the highest frequency of specularity on pieces was found on pots in southern Arizona and in the Altar Valley. Some southern Arizona, like Tucson Mountains area, and then Altar Valley, I saw actually on MinDat some spots like more here in the Magdalena Valley, but in a really old geological survey, there is an iron kind of deposit right around in here, I think just like in like the town of Altar area. And so what Claypatch found was that the closer to those sources of specular hematite, the more common it was to have a specular variety of pigment on the pots that were found in those areas. And so the pots were found in those areas doesn't necessarily mean they were made in those areas, but something to think about. Previously the archaeologists thought that the correlation of how specular the pots were had to do only with the degree of polishing, and that the more polishing done over the pigment, the less specular it ended up being. Claypatch's work shows that to not be true, or he found a lot of pots that were contradicting that. And then, just briefly got into some of the research done by Mats Merman with ONB, and they were doing actual tests, going out and finding the sources in the Tucson Mountains of the specular hematite and creating pigments and putting those with different clay binders on different types of clay and with different degrees of polishing. And what they found is that if you're polishing on a very dry piece, that seemed to reduce the specularity after firing. But if you're polishing it into like a leather hard piece of clay pottery, that increased the specularity. So it might have to do with techniques that way as well. And yeah, I was very sad to hear about Mott's passing. I didn't know he was researching all that. When I looked him up, he's just a true geologist and researcher. It's really great. But I did meet him briefly, which was very nice. So to what I've been doing then as pigment tests is I had that sifted specular hematite, and I levigated that to make it even more fine, so floating it out in water to get just the finest particles of that. And then I added, by volume, I thought it was about 1/3 clay, but I think I was doing like pretty rough estimate kind of measuring, and I think it was a little bit less. I'm guessing 20-25% clay binder. The Claybody is the red clay from the UP of Michigan. The binder clay that I used is a yellow clay from South Dakota near the Badlands that turns really nice red. And it seems to be a pretty low firing clay. I was just looking for like a pretty low firing clay for my binder to hope that it would harden in the fire really well. But my paint was fugitive after firing, so it did rub off pretty easily. It was nice and sparkly, but I was thinking, okay, there's not enough clay binder in that. This piece here was surface fired, so it was a lower temperature. And this piece here I fired in an electric kiln, so it went up to about 1900 Fahrenheit. And I was thinking at that temperature, surely the pigment should not be fugitive, but it was still. So more testing to follow. So again, so this is my purple on red test pieces. So I used that same yellow clay from South Dakota that turns this nice red in the firing. And then this time I used, again, the levigated specular hematite. That's what it looks like, real fine powder. And I made sure to measure really well and added a true 1/3 of my clay binder. I still painted it on dry pots, just because that's how the timing worked out in my studio. And used, otherwise everything else was the same, except for it was being painted onto that yellow red firing slip rather than onto the clay body itself. And so you can see the difference here between a surface fired test and an electric fired test. The red slip definitely comes out much brighter in the electric firing because it's like pure oxidation. But here where you've got a little bit of reduced oxygen, it's not quite as red. I lost a lot of the specularity in this piece. In this electric fired one, it's crazy sparkly still, very sparkly. And so thinking about that with my next test, I wanted to see if it made any difference what slip it was on. So I made this test pot with 6 different wild clay slips. One of those is that red firing one, and a Cannonball white, and then a Colorado white, and then a mixture of the two, and then a couple different yellowy clays from Colorado and South Dakota also. And again with a 1/3 clay binder. This time it did seem that the pigments stayed really well and were not fugitive on all of the slips. But on the back side of the pot, I did some of the pigment just on the bare clay again, And that did seem to be a little bit fugitive still, even with, I did some that was 33, that third clay binder, and I did some that was 50% clay binder, so half and half with the specular hematite. And they seem to both be, like they say pretty well, but they both rub off a little bit, about the same amount. So I was kind of surprised about that. The extra clay binder didn't really seem to help with that. But again, this was painted on a dry pot at the last minute. So maybe that really is a big part of it, that I'm not burnishing it in to the piece. And so far I hadn't been burnishing anything over the pigment at all. I burnished these slips a little bit polished before painting the pigment on, but I hadn't burnished over the actual pigment. And so yeah, these are pretty consistent with the first tests, the surface wood-fired tests. It doesn't have a lot of sparkle to it at all. You can't see any in this photo. It does have a little bit in real life, but not much. Yeah, pot dryness at the time of painting, I think, does affect it, and or the polishing, but we'll have to test a little bit more to find out. And so my next thought was the amount of oxidation that the pieces are getting in the amount of oxygen they're getting in the firing, and maybe that affects the amount of specularity you get afterwards. Because out of all my pieces, like the electric fired ones still all looked very sparkly, and the surface fired ones pretty much all did not, except for this one. As you see, it broke because it did blow up in the firing, but it didn't have enough temper in it, and I kind of knew that going in, but it was one of my first test pieces. But this firing in particular, I actually removed all the pieces before they cooled very much. We were actually a little bit worried that the fire was getting too hot, so we pulled all the fuel away and we started pulling pots out. And so this one did get a lot of oxidation as it was cooling. And that is the only one that is still very sparkly. Again, that fugitive paint, you can kind of see where it wiped off. But it did stay very sparkly. So that is my next question. Does the limited oxidation, specifically during the cooling of the firing, affect the specularity? So that'll be the next thing that I'm testing for. And that's the end of my slides. So, but yeah, I'm excited to keep testing it. I do have another test bowl, basically identical to this one, just different designs that I brought with me to fire. So when we do the surface firings on Sunday, I'll put that in one, and we'll try to get a really good oxidation firing and see if we can get that one to stay specular. And then I do have another pot that I'm working on right now that's, still leather hard, but I did do some polishing over the specular hematite pigment, and it looks gorgeous right now, super shiny and sparkly. And so I don't know if that one will be dry by Sunday, but if it is, I'll try to fire that one too and see if that holds its sparkle as well. Otherwise, we'll follow up with that one after the conference. So yeah, I'll put it on my references here and see if there are any questions, I guess, right away. Yeah.
What cone were you firing the electric at?
Usually I'm firing to 04, cone 04 with like that Michigan red clay. It's a low fire red clay. So that's about 1900 Fahrenheit, just under or just over around 1900. But I have gone up to cone 6 and cone 9 with it. At least as like a temper Claybody additive.
You're saying it's melting at cone 9?
A little bit melting at cone 9, yeah. In the porcelain, yeah, it seemed like where we had a lot of it in one area, like where my husband was marbling it in, it seems like that's meltier than like this. We blended it all in to the clay body, as we were processing the clay body. And I guess it's just tiny dots that are maybe melty, and so it doesn't look as melty, but some of it is a little bit, yeah. Yeah.
So you've experimented with using it as timber and as paint. In the original, the older ancient pots, were they using it as timber or just exclusively paint?
I haven't seen anything about originally anyone using it as a temper. just as the pigment. Yeah, personally. Okay.
When you say clay binder, are you using the same clay body for the clay binder on the pieces?
I have not, because let's see, I was using the same clay as the slip here, but these are just on the bare clay body, and so it's a different clay. And yeah, so every time it seems like it's not working on this clay body, it actually is a different clay binder on that clay body. So that's definitely another thing to test and see if that makes a difference. I'm confused as to why that would make a difference, but it might. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Help in front here. How about?
Are you using a wild clay as a clay binder?
Yeah.
Raw clay?
Yeah, they're all wild clays. Yeah, so the binder was a yellow clay from like interior South Dakota near the Badlands. So it's a pretty low firing, like probably smectitic clay, but it's it was from the age of dinosaurs. They talk about in the Badlands visitor center where they like show you. I forget the actual name of that soil layer, but it was like a yellow soil layer they were talking about in there. And I did find some on the side of the road, not in the national park. Um, uh, and, and yeah, it is a really nice brighter red than my clay body is just kind of this like orangey red from Michigan. So I was using it mostly because it was a very red one, so that it so that it would be the same as the red slip that I was putting it on here. So that does seem to stick much better, or somehow, incorporate itself into the matrix of the clay better. Yeah. Person Craig, yeah.
Have you experimented with painting it on an already fired piece and then refiring?
I have not yet, but like I said, my husband's always pushing the limits in the studio. We just mixed a bunch of it in with that wild glaze I mentioned from the UP of Michigan. It's a wild material that's called saprolite. It's a rotten stone, basically. So it's, or some people call it feldspar flour, but it's basically like ready to go. Just add water glaze off the riverbank. But it's I think they say in the paperwork and the surveys that it might melt at like cone 3, which is like 2200 or something, but it's more of a high fire, like stoneware glaze. But Josh just mixed a lot of the Specular Hematite with just a little bit of that glaze, and he's put that on a bisque fired piece to then fire it with that Specular Hematite glaze, basically. So he's just doing like just enough glaze to hopefully get it to stick on the pot rather than a clay binder, since it is a bisque fired piece already. That was kind of what we came up with to try starting to do, using that sort of as a pigment after the piece has already been fired. But if you had a clay that didn't shrink a whole lot, you might be able to do that and still put it on a bisque fired piece. But I have not tried that yet. It's waiting to be fired. And any other questions? And then, oh yeah.
You may have missed it, but in the pottery, is the specular iron hematite pigment burnished into clay by the designs to be burnished over to into?
Like, did the trincheras burnish it? I think yes, and definitely in some cases. Some of the old archaeologists that Clay Patch referenced had said that if it was polished over the paint, then certain conditions existed to them. So it seemed like sometimes it was and sometimes it wasn't. I didn't really know that when I started, so I wasn't doing any of the polishing over it. I was just kind of lightly polishing it first. I've just got like a leather hard pot right now that I am polishing. Yeah, so I'm just getting to that now finally. Yeah, so no results on that yet. It looks gorgeous before firing though. I was just gonna say so I did bring all of these test pieces with me. So whenever it makes sense at some point this weekend, I can set them out somewhere, and anyone who's interested can come take a look. And because they definitely look very different than on camera. It's really hard to, like I said, catch that sparkle. But so I'll have those for people to look at if you're interested. Question? Oh yeah, sure, yeah. Get some good references. Yeah. Yeah, that investigations into broadline purple on red with Mats Merman. I just barely started reading that when I was putting this presentation together, but it looks very interesting. Like I said, he has tests where he was collecting material from the Tucson Mountains and actually doing firings with those. Yeah.
Have you tried, Lots brought some pieces to one of the little Tucson dips put together where he used fairly coarse material that did not melt, still well adhered to the clay. It was gorgeous, of course, but have you tried any of the coarse material, or do you find it's better to get this sparkle with the fine material?
I haven't tried painting like the pigment with the coarse material. I did notice, I think in that paper that Mats wrote, that coarser material, coarser specular hematite did seem to be more specular after firing than the finer stuff. I mean, definitely when it's used like as a temper in the clay body, it stays very sparkly, and that's pretty coarse, the stuff I use for that. Yeah, but I think he did start to talk about that. And he also mentioned in that study, though, that they were electric firing all their tests. And so I'm very curious about the oxidation versus reduction in the firing and how that affects it. 'Cause from first glance at his paper, it didn't seem like they were doing that test. He said they were not using wood, that they were electric firing. Yeah.
Is that what's in the Macaco's clay from New Mexico?
That's mica. Yeah. So yeah, mica is a silicate, I think, and so yeah, this is the iron version, basically, kind of that similar type of crystalline structure where it's flaky and super shiny, mirror-like shiny. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan.
I probably missed it. But what's the geological way that this specular hematite forms? What's the geology?
I wish I knew. I started to go down that rabbit hole a little bit again while I was preparing this presentation. I tend to just keep doing research instead of actually like finalizing my presentation. But the mine database, I think it was actually geology.com, looked like if you could really learn a lot into that. But yeah, I guess I'm not sure exactly how it forms. But it's very cool. Well, all right, thank you. Is that?